I want to start with how in the world this guy from, Southeast Michigan ends up writing for and living in Myanmar, writing for a magazine about this country that is one of the most opaque in the world.
Yeah, well, I think its opaqueness is one thing that drew me to it. I mean, I was extremely curious about it, but also, when I did move there, it had some momentum of opening up. People were learning a lot more about it. It was starting to democratize, and it was gearing up somewhat for its next election, which was sort of an important milestone for solidifying the sort of movement towards democracy. So that was an interesting story. Also, many years, a decade ago maybe, when I was studying journalism in Chicago, my brother and I volunteered with a refugee resettlement group that helped families that were becoming American citizens and resettling in Chicago. And some of the families we worked with were from Myanmar, and so I got to know them. Some of the kids were about my age. I was just fascinated that, other people my age grow up in this, completely different world. So that had always stayed with me. Around that same time, I was really obsessed with George Orwell. And Orwell, he had spent years when he was young in what was then Burma, and had written beautifully and interestingly about it. So it's just a place that had been in the back of my mind. And one year I realized I was getting kind of old and hadn't done the foreign correspondent thing. And if I didn't just pick a country and move there, it might not happen. So I just did it.
So you picked the country before you ever found the magazine?
Yeah, so I thought I had been to Bangkok, Thailand before, and I thought it would be pretty easy to find work there. I wanted to find journalism work. If I couldn't, I knew I could maybe teach English. Luckily, I found some writing work there, but I moved there and started meeting journalists and met one person who knew some reporters in Yangon, went over there to visit. A few months later, one of those guys emailed me and said, "This place is hiring, it's a good entry. It's a good place to start."
Crazy. I love that you just did this on a wing and a prayer. I mean, it was just really, you just had faith that it was going to work out.
Yeah.
So you talked about, and we all, the world watched, because we did feel like maybe this country was finally being democratized a little bit, and then you watched the opposite start to happen.
Yeah, it was devastating, and it was also really surreal. There was maybe one analyst or one editor who had voiced the week before, some suspicion. And then in the few days before it, there was news that these talks had gone really bad between the military leader and the civilian government. But I think even with this, it seemed like speculation, and there was no way this government, after the progress that this country has made, economically, politically, in every measure, health-wise, education, that they would actually be so, I think the decision was like really petty, sort of. They were unhappy that they had been shown to be so unpopular with the election. They couldn't accept it. And it was also surreal to watch something similar playing out at home at the same time, where this one group of people was seeming to refuse. We have rules, we have monitors to watch that the rules are being followed and systems to ensure that. And then one party is just completely incalcitrant. And, the January 6th thing happened about a month before the Myanmar coup, so it was a pretty fascinating month to be thinking about these things and thinking about democracy.
At a certain point, you must have appreciated that your job was growing increasingly dangerous. Military takeovers generally frown on freedom of the press. So was that palpable, or were you stunned when you were arrested?
Well, both. It was palpable, and we had been doing some reporting on the press crackdowns, but they were largely targeting local reporters, which is often the case, and when they do find a foreigner, it seemed that they wanted to get them out of there, kick them out, which is also often the case in other countries. They had arrested a couple foreign reporters and immediately deported them. And I was an editor, you know, so my byline wasn't extremely out there. I have friends who were writing for big papers and were loud on social media, anti-coup loud. And we watched every time they would go to the airport. Everybody knew the airport was a site to sort of fear. We would kind of hold our breath and wait to get a text from them from the next city that they would depart to. And I watched all of my friends who had bigger profiles than me kind of fly out. So I really didn't think my name was on a list. And because of that, I tried to stay as long as I could.
Did you feel like, I mean, obviously, you feel strongly about the work that your magazine was doing. Did you feel like there was ever anything incendiary, or you thought, ooh, we're starting to brush up against this line that may be trouble?
One thing that they did, the military did early on, was declare it illegal to use certain words, like junta and coup. You've seen this in other countries as well. You know, Russia did something similar with war and invasion. And we pushed back against that. And a lot of other newsrooms that also pushed back against it were targeted and had their newsrooms raided. They were primarily publishing in Burmese, and we primarily publish in English. We, you know, you said I felt strongly about my work. One thing that we were doing at Frontier was we had a team of local reporters that grew up there, that know the context, that know the country, and want to tell the story of their country to the international community. And so I was finding a lot of meaning in that, as being a conduit, as playing a part in allowing locals to tell the story globally.
Well, in fact, a good question is, who really is the publication for? If you're publishing in English, where's the messaging, where are you hoping to land?
Well, frankly, you know, I love the New York Times, and I love the Washington Post, and I love the Wall Street Journal, and I love all these great, venerable outlets. But I think every reporter that is a Southeast Asia bureau chief is reading Frontier, and I think, you know, depending on a lot of the work that we do, and that's fine, there's an ecosystem for it, whatever amplifies the story. And I think also a lot of diplomats, European, American, you know, globally, a lot of the diplomatic community and the NGO community that's there. I mean, there's a community of people that have spent the last 10 years trying to improve lives in Myanmar, and I think most of them are reading what Frontier's reporting.
Yeah, that's really great. I think it's really easy for the rest of the world to kind of miss how these circles work around, you know, and why journalism's so important all over the world, too. And
why local journalism's important. I mean, you know, I wouldn't expect somebody in, you know, Des Moines to be reading Frontier, but if they are, if something we publish gets the Times to cover it, not gets, but encourages, not that they're not doing their own original reporting, but, you know, there's an ecosystem there, and I think that's okay.
Yeah, completely right. So take me through, have you ever seen the movie A Year of Living Dangerously?
No.
You have to watch this. It's as a journalist, it's one of my favorite movies of all time anyway, but it's about a reporter. It happens to be Australian, but Mel Gibson plays a reporter who's trying to report from Jakarta, and there's a military junta going on, and he gets, you know, they're trying to arrest him at the airport. It all flashed in my mind as I was, when I, you know, first read about your arrest. So you have to.
I've been getting a lot of book and movie recommendations. I'm shocked nobody's told me to see that.
It's one of my favorite movies. As a journalist, you'll get it anyway. But it really speaks to, you know, military takeovers and the collision of that with journalism. Especially because I love that you mentioned how the airport is central to that. Take me through your arrest.
Yeah. So so the morning of, you know, I had my backpack packed. It was just a backpack. And I had a couple, I was coming home to visit my family. My parents' birthdays were in about a month, a little more than a month. And I was going to surprise them for their birthdays.
You did that.
Yeah, well, I did surprise them. But I had planned to get here earlier and stay in Chicago so that I could get vaccinated, wait for it to become effective, and then surprise them. So was kind of in the back of my head. I knew I might not be able to come back. So I was kind of taking the things that I really wanted to hang on to. And some of those things were my business cards and credentials from different news outlets I had worked at. So I had the one that I currently work for, Frontier Myanmar. I also had one from a previous outlet. That previous outlet is staunchly anti-military. They always have been. When I worked there, I did some reporting on businesses that the military had partnered with, foreign businesses, and sort of the response from the human rights community. So maybe that was on their radar. But they were after this outlet, and they were after anybody that was associated with it.
Not Frontier.
Not Frontier,
the other
one I had previously worked at.
Yeah.
So, you know, I packed my bag, including those business cards, but wasn't really thinking too much about it. Got to the airport. There were a lot of COVID protocols at the time, so to get on the flight, once you're at the gate, they give you a full medical gown. They were giving you at the time a full medical gown, a hairnet, gloves. I had put everything on and was waiting at the gate to board the flight when like a group of maybe 8 or 10 police officers just kind of walked up to the gate and said they were looking for Jacob Fenster. And yeah, I just kind of like, I was kind of looked around and kind of, yeah, that's me. I was shocked and anxious. They said, we want to ask you some questions about a criminal investigation. But I was shocked and I was anxious, but I really did not anticipate that they were gonna, I figured they were after the editors of that outlet, and they had all mostly fled the country already. And I just figured there's no way they're gonna, there's not much they can get out of me. There's no way they're gonna hold on to me. They'll see that pretty quickly. They started asking me questions. They found that business card, and that's when they just stopped asking questions, and they said, you're arrested. And then by the end of that day, they set me down in front of a judge, and the judge told me, this judge was at a makeshift court inside the prison. And so the judge just said, you're charged with these crimes. Your next court date is in 2 weeks. And I thought, this is absurd. There's no way I'm gonna be here for 2 weeks. I won't be vaccinated in time for my parents' birthday. Like, I was still thinking, this is my time frame for the summer. And then by the end of that night, I started thinking I'd have to stay there for 2 weeks. But that's about, in the beginning, all I had thought was, wow, I can't believe I'll be here for 2 weeks.
We're back at the airport, and so by now you're trying to figure out who all you got to tell and how you can tell them.
Yeah, well, my partner Juliana, she worked for the Brazilian embassy. She was in the Brazilian Foreign Service, and was also just the first person I would go to anyway. So when they were leading me away for the questioning, I was texting her. I was like, I'm being detained. Please call the American embassy. And she thought I was messing around with her. She didn't believe it at first, and she kept saying, you're joking, you're joking. And I was like, I'm not joking. They're gonna take the phone soon, I'm sure. And then she called. While they were questioning me, she called. And I just answered. I said, babe, not joking. Call the embassy. And then they snatched the phone. And so I knew she had immediately contacted the U.S. Embassy, but it was still a month before I got any contact with anybody outside of the prison. I was sitting there not knowing what was going on, but I was pretty certain that at least the embassy knew, and Juliana knew. But yeah, it took a month to get any phone calls or anything.
For people who travel, I'm not sure there's too many worse nightmares than being in a prison in a foreign country under a different set of laws, and of course, the rougher the political terrain, the worse it sounds. So they're marching you into a jail cell, and you're thinking, what?
For a really long time, I thought, I understood that they were after this previous outlet I worked for. And it was so obvious, and there was so much evidence that I had quit the summer prior and had been working at this other place for so long. I just didn't think it was gonna last very long. I knew of one other dual citizen, a Myanmar American, Nathan Mong, who had been detained. And I think because of his American citizenship, in about 2 months, or 2.5 maybe, he was released. For the first 2-3 months. I had sort of set that as a worst case scenario. I'll be here for 3 months. And really, I think any duration is manageable if you know there's an end date and you know when it is. When it kept going on beyond that, that's really when I started getting anxious and everything. But other than that, once you get into the cell and then the sun rises the next morning and you see the people around you, these weren't violent people. They were mostly political prisoners or public officials on petty corruption charges. Once the sun rises and you realize where you are and you're not being beaten or starved, it's okay. It's just not knowing how or when it's going to end.
Insane prison obviously is sort of notoriously crazy for its name, but you didn't find yourself among murderers and rapists.
Well, somebody that was, by the circumstances, a close friend and also an extremely helpful person was there for murder, but he had committed a crime maybe 20 years prior, and he had been there for 20 years and spoke very fluent English. But he wasn't an aggressive or violent person. I don't know, I'm not making any statements about, life sentences or, reformation. This one individual he was very helpful and he was great. There were others in there for other crimes, but I didn't see anything beyond the normal sort of arguments and fights that would happen when you stuff 500 men together.
Yeah. I've heard you describe your jail experience, and I know you relied on these every 2 weeks. Juliana was able to get food to you.
Mm-hmm.
But what was the food in the prison itself like? What were you being served, and how often were you getting to eat? What was that like?
Yeah, so they would bring 2 meals a day. So they'd bring one around 8 a.m. and they'd bring in this big plastic bucket of, I guess you'd call it a bean soup, but it was just this like salt water with like a few beans. It would be a scramble to get any of the actual beans, first come, first serve. And then an equally large bucket of white rice. And that was every morning. And then every day at around 3 p.m., they would bring a curry that either had a little bit of chicken or a little bit of fish or beans. So those were the 2 meals. Neither were particularly tasty. I got really sick of white rice. There was a commissary that you could once a week place an order, and I would get apples and bananas and potato chips and some small things like that. But you had a limited amount of items and a limited amount of money that you could spend. Juliana was also putting money into my prison commissary account. Yeah. And that money had to be split also with toothpaste, soap, detergent for your clothing and dishes.
Yeah. At a certain point, you had to come to realize, I'm not leaving here tomorrow or in these next 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. Did that moment get pretty heavy?
Yeah, well, so, like I said, for a couple months, it was all right, especially once I got contact with outside, and I knew, my parents knew, and I knew they were working on it, and my brother, and the embassy. But about 3 months in or so, 3 or 4 months, the courts were just shut down completely for COVID. And I was there with a lot of people that were not convicted, but on trial. And they had told me they'd been there for years on trial because the court shuts down because a judge is sick. A witness doesn't show up, so they postpone it for 2 weeks. And that's when I started realizing this is dragging on, and I'm not getting special treatment. This is not the previous government. This is not a government that the United States has any ties, diplomatic relationship with, or contact with. I don't think I'm getting treated any differently, and these guys have all been here for several years. Some of them not even political cases. That's just the nature of the quote-unquote legal system there. And that's when I started to get pretty terrified and pretty demoralized.
Yeah. I know you were spending most of your free time reading. It's about all there was to do. Were you going bananas?
Some days, yeah, and other days were not as bad. Yeah, it's depending on, you know, every morning you have a new shot at not going nuts.
What was the difference each day?
I don't know.
I mean, I suppose the days when packages showed up from Juliana was
Yeah.
a pretty good day.
That was great, yeah. And then you find little milestones. You know they're going to come every 15 days, so you're just waiting for that and anticipating and being excited by, you know, what books she was going to bring the next time.
And notes.
Notes, yeah. Well, she would write, a lot of people wrote letters to me. And then she and I, because she was in Yangon, some prisoners, if they got paroled or pardoned, I could give them something to bring to her when they left. Sometimes when I was going to court, I could sneak a note to my lawyer, and he would give it to her. She found ways to sneak messages into the packages that she was bringing. So yeah, the little things like that, the little games and things you try to figure out. Other things that, when they would bring the food that you order from the commissary, sometimes they would bring them in cardboard boxes. And if I could establish a relationship with the guys who would deliver it, that they would come to me last so the box was empty and I could keep the box, then I had a table or I had a new wardrobe. And so you find little games and things to like make tiny improvements, and that's another thing to do. It's amazing how helpful a table is. I had no idea. Just bending over less and organizing things.
Little things.
Yeah.
What do you suppose you missed most? I mean, you had to focus on those kind of things, or maybe those are the things that help drive you crazy, but what did you find yourself thinking about a lot?
People. I mean, my family, my friends and family everywhere, but particularly in this community, in Metro Detroit. I was thinking a lot about Huntington Woods and Royal Oak and Detroit, and the people that I knew growing up and the people that I knew at Wayne State, and like, I don't know, there's just constantly people in the neighborhoods that were like etched in my mind.
Yeah. This may be a really dumb question because I've never been in this kind of, especially this prison. I've never been in prison, let's make that clear. But did you ever give any kind of crazy thought to, is there a way for me to escape, or does that not happen?
Constantly.
Oh.
I don't think I ever got anywhere near trying to do that, but I was there was a tall brick wall surrounding our yard, and it wasn't that tall, and I was constantly staring at it, thinking about it. I was also exercising a lot in there, and I was like, you know, at some points I was feeling like stronger and healthier than I had been in a while, and I was like, so if I jumped and pushed off of there, I could get this height on the next wall. But I knew right behind that wall was the women's prison, and behind that wall was a neighborhood that's closed off to the rest of the city where all the prison guards live. They all live on the compound. I knew it was not possible, but I was thinking about it all the time.
Yeah,
yeah.
I'll bet. Wow. This moment when you get sentenced to 11 years.
Yeah. It's funny, there's two things that were happening at the time. I knew going into that the process was they had to find me guilty. They're not going to have a fair trial and then say, okay, you're innocent, you can go home. That would be very embarrassing that they've kept somebody there that long and they've made that big of a mistake. So they have to find you guilty, and then they're going to say, because we're so magnanimous and we're such generous people, we're going to give you a pardon. So that was kind of already on the table. My lawyer told me that on day one. Juliana was telling me that. The embassy, I think, probably signaled that. So I knew that I had to get a conviction. But then the day of, there were a lot of police officers that interrogated me and investigated me in the beginning that were saying, we've heard rumors you're flying home today. The trial's going to end today and you're going to go to the airport from here. And then I asked my lawyer about it, and he's like, you know, I've never seen that happen, but there's an immigration official here, and I've never seen that. Maybe they are going to take you to the airport. And I was like, oh my God, this might end. There was just so much positive energy in the courtroom that day. So I kind of got my hopes up, and then we went through the process, and then they announced the sentence, and they said 11 years with hard labor, guilty on like every charge.
So you're thinking all these signs are pointing to it, and then they throw out 11 years.
Yeah, and guilty on every charge with the maximum sentence for every charge. So it seemed like maybe this wasn't the plan. And so I was just terrified and devastated. I had thought something had gone terribly wrong, because I had been so certain that it would go a certain way. And I was just, after they announced it, you could feel the mood in the courtroom just kind of drop. And all these people that had been telling me we've got good signs wouldn't make eye contact and started quietly packing their things and like leaving. And nobody would really talk to me except for my own attorney. And he was such a straightforward guy. The entire time he had been like, when everyone's like, you know, this is gonna happen, that's gonna happen, he would say like, I don't know, this is what we're gonna do, and you know, just be strong. And I'm like, so is that it? And he's like, yeah. And he's like, well, we can file an appeal. And I'm like, file an appeal to the government that already just decided this? They walked into the court and handed the judge an envelope. It wasn't like she adjudicated it. I'm like, that would be completely pointless. And he's like, you're right, it would. And then they just processed me as a convict instead of a detainee on trial. They gave me the uniform, they shackled my hands and feet and took me back to prison. So that day I was pretty terrified. But that was on a Friday. Already by the next morning I had like taken some time to think about it, and I was like, well, we did know we need a guilty conviction. Got the guilty conviction. Who knows what's going to happen? And later that day they gave me a COVID swab, which was really bizarre. They had never tested anybody in there before that. And everybody around me was like, well, they tested you because they're going to send you home. And I was like, yeah, heard that one before. So I didn't really get my hopes up, but I thought, well, who knows? I've got the conviction. Now they're giving me a swab. We'll see what happens. And it was like that for 2 days. And on Monday morning, they drove me to the Capitol. And in the Capitol, they finally told me they were giving me a pardon.
In fact, that day around you didn't even know where you were going, right, when you left?
Yeah, on Saturday, I think they gave me the swab and told me to stay in my cell. But it's funny because the building everything's pretty open air. There are bars, but like, you know, I'm leaning on the bar talking to the guys outside who are also leaning on the bars. And so they're like, so I'm in cell quarantine, and they're like, yeah, they haven't swabbed anybody. There's no other reason. They're gonna put you on a international flight and they have to get a test first. I'm like, okay, we'll see what happens. And then Sunday passed, and then Monday morning, they would usually open the doors at 7. At Monday morning, at about 6 a.m., they came to my cell and just told me to pack up. I said, you have 5 minutes to pack a bag. They wouldn't tell me where we were going. They took me to the office and were processing paperwork and doing whatever. Wouldn't tell me anything. They handed me over to a group of like 6 plainclothes men with guns outside of the prison, and they cuffed me and shackled me and put me in a car, an SUV with all of them, and then we just started driving. And I was thinking we're driving to the airport, but nobody would talk and nobody would tell me anything. And we was driving towards the airport, and we kept getting closer and closer, and then went right past it. And like maybe 40 minutes later, outside of Yangon, I tried to ask them where we were driving, and the guy I asked that to, he just says, don't speak. It's like, oh, okay. And so it was in drive for another 3 or 4 hours. I realized we were driving towards the Capitol, and that made sense to me, but I didn't know why. It didn't make any sense that they would take me to the Capitol to release me. I thought, okay, here's another phase of the process. Maybe they're moving me to a prison in Naypyidaw. There's some high-profile politicians and one high-profile foreigner, economic advisor to the previous government, who were being held in Naypyidaw. I was like, well, maybe I've been designated VIP, you know, big status detainee, and they're going to keep us all in Naypyidaw. I don't know what that means, but we'll have to see when we get there.
Did you have an idea or a thought of what hard labor meant?
I never had a clear understanding. Everybody in prison that was a convict had a job, and some of those jobs were agricultural. The prison, there was a lot of vegetables and things being grown. And that maybe that was it. I've still never gotten an actual clear idea.
So you get to the Capitol all these hours later.
Yeah, we get to the Capitol, and we get to a police station in the Capitol, and still nobody's telling me anything. They just sat me down in a chair, and I had to wait there for quite a while, just staring. There was a desk in front of me. I just had to sit and stare at this empty desk and not move. People were sitting in the back of the room behind me, just watching me, and every time I tried to ask them a question, they wouldn't respond, and they just told me to just sit there. And then after some hours, a group of uniformed police officers came, and one of them, chief, I guess, sat behind the desk and through a translator just said, you know, you've been charged with these crimes, you've been found guilty, we're going to give you a pardon. And I said, we want to give you a pardon. We just want to make sure that you understand not to report fake news, not to report fake news, and to be careful of the sources that you use, which, by those words, I was more than happy to sign. They didn't want me to say anything bad about...
You mean to act like a journalist?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is what I had been doing the whole time. They didn't want me to like write anything about the police or the prison, I think. And, well, they didn't say, they said, we're not impugning on your ability to express yourself freely, but don't say anything false or something. And then they had a law in the books called the Unlawful Associations Act, which is one of the several things I was charged with. Once they call somebody a terrorist, you can't contact them. Obviously, all these dissident politicians and the shadow government and all that were, you know...
People you were talking to.
Yeah, we were getting quotes from, comments from... they didn't say, don't contact this person or that person. They said, carefully of your sources. I said, of course, always. Those are still sources that you need to contact. But anyway...
This almost sounds like they were telling you, were they giving you the option to stay?
No, they definitely weren't giving me the option to stay. But I think they knew I was going to continue reporting and writing about Myanmar.
Yeah.
I mean, frankly, they just gave me a book deal. I mean, like, you know, they gave me a great platform to continue speaking out against them.
You'll remember them, I'm sure, in your...
Yeah, they'll be in the acknowledgments.
The acknowledgments, yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that was maybe their thinking.
So he tells you that this, and then what happens? How long before you're actually sitting on an airplane?
It was another couple hours, but from there, from that police station, they said, we're going to take you to the airport where the delegation that will be taking you home will be. I said, all right. And they took me to the airport, and it was another maybe hour or so of waiting in a separate room in the airport.
Are you out of your shackles by now? And you're
out of my shackles? Well, I was still handcuffed and taken to the airport, and then when we were in that room, they took the shackles off. But still wouldn't let me leave the room, and gave me back a bunch of my belongings, and then said, this is what we took, this is what you were arrested with, my backpack, some clothing, you know, some other things like that, and a sheet that had that all listed out, and it said, sign that we're giving it back to you. So then I had my bag, and I'm just waiting there, and then they're like, okay, the delegation is here, and they led me into the lobby of the airport, and then there was the ambassador, the consular official, Bill Richardson, all of those folks just waiting there. So I kind of shook all their hands, and we walked out on the tarmac. And the Richardson Foundation had a private jet waiting for us.
Best flight of your life?
Oh my God. Best flight of my life, best day of my life. It's bittersweet knowing that I'll never, ever have as good of an afternoon as that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me ask you now some navel-gazing questions. What did you learn about yourself through this whole thing? How many days was it total? Have you done it by days? I meant to do that, and I forgot to.
It was 170 something.
170 something, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah. I don't know exactly.
Yeah.
175 maybe.
just about half a year.
Yeah, yeah. A little less.
So what'd you learn about yourself that maybe you didn't know before?
You know, I'll say one thing. I don't know what I learned about myself, but one thing I did think a lot about is the guy in the cell next to me was a monk, a Buddhist monk, and we would talk a lot about, you know, he was in there on some really bizarre circumstances that would never happen in a country with the rule of law. And I'd ask him how he's not so aggravated and frustrated and, you know, about this injustice. And his notions of detachment, you know, and suffering kind of only existing in the mind, were really, really profound. The one thing that I could never understand was the way that detachment extends to people and to loved ones. He was very loving, and he was, you know, formed relationships. I'm not saying that he didn't, but he had an ability to sort of, you know, independently go through the experience. I knew in a way that I'd never had to think about, that I wouldn't have gotten through that without knowing that my family and Juliana were on the outside, and wanting to see them was such an important driving factor every day. So being detached from people, I mean, I think maybe I've always taken for granted the importance of these relationships, but I think definitely that was a thing.
Yeah. I don't know what kind of thoughts you had before about political prisoners and hostages even that are held, and what our government should be willing to do to help extract people from these situations. But has your experience changed your thinking on that at all, or it certainly has informed your thinking on it?
Well, informed it in a way where the empathy that I think I would naturally feel, and that anybody would naturally feel when you see somebody unjustly detained, it's much more visceral now. But I still don't, you know, in terms of formulating policy, you know, some people think that giving concessions incentivizes hostage taking, and then you're going to have more hostages taken. Other people think that the government should do whatever they can, including political or financial concessions or payments, just to get those people home. I don't know. I mean, I think it's an interesting, important debate. I think both sides they have really good intentions and motivations, and solid points. I mean, it's increased my empathy for anybody wrongfully detained.
Paul Whelan,
Yeah.
another Michigander.
Yeah. I don't know what the right solution is. I mean, you know, one thing I learned that I didn't know existed is there's this whole sort of fringe diplomacy. There are things that private individuals and NGOs can do that governments don't think that they can do. And in my case, that worked out. I mean, I think that's really something to think about, is all these other networks that exist.
Yeah. You talked earlier about thinking so much while you were in about Detroit and Huntington Woods and Royal Oak. So describe for me what it was like to get back here.
Oh man, it was amazing. You know, I really love the summer here, and I really hate the winter here. It's just a part of growing up here. So I got back and it was the winter, and that was a bit unfortunate. But I mean, I grew up on Leo's Coney Island, and I really wanted a Leo's Greek salad. The greatest restaurant on the planet is the Pita Cafe in Oak Park. And I wanted hummus and falafel and fattoush and everything there. And we got a lot of that right away. So that was really helpful.
Can I assume we're skipping bean soup and curry for a little while?
Yeah. No more white rice. Yeah, I can't eat white rice anymore at all.
Lastly, is there anybody, and maybe you answered this when you talked about the monk, is there anybody that you're going to miss? Because I think a prison connection has to be unique and intense, right? You're both you and all these other people are in such life-altering circumstances.
Yeah.
Is there anybody you're going to think about a lot over the years? I mean, obviously the monk.
Yeah, well, you know, actually, I mean, my memories are a lot more intense, not just because it was an intense, dramatic experience. But because like when you put somebody in a small area and you take away the cell phone and you take away work and you take away communications with others, you're really focused on everything that's, you know, kind of the present. I don't mean in like a mindfulness, peaceful way, but just in an interesting way. You're really, each moment is much more memorable. So everybody there are guys that I hated there. There were guards that I hated. There were other prisoners that I didn't particularly like, but I'm never going to forget their personalities, their faces. There were several people that I absolutely loved. The monk, next to the monk was a Rohingya Muslim guy, who was also one of the only fluent English speakers. I'll tell you a really interesting anecdote I don't think I've shared before. I randomly, a year before, I had gone to a friend's wedding in Poland, and I'm Jewish, my friend is Jewish. They gave out yarmulkes at the wedding, and I took one as like a token to remember it. That was in my backpack when I was coming home as a souvenir sort of thing. And for whatever reason, when they sent me to prison, you know, they let me take a few articles of clothing. I took that. I have no idea why. I'm not religious. It's completely a cultural thing. But I would talk to the Muslim about, he would go to the mosque every Friday in prison, and he would wear this hat, a topi. It's like a kind of square hat. And one day we traded. He gave me one of his topis, and I gave him my yarmulke, and I still have that. And I'll always remember him. There was a young prisoner there that was a fluent English speaker who also had a small library of really good English language books, shockingly. That got me through the first few days. And I still actually talk to him on Signal. The other guys I haven't been able to get a hold of. The Muslim's still in prison. The monk, I've heard, has been released, and I'm trying to track him down.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Was most of the conversation, I mean, were you only talking to people who spoke English, or have you picked up enough? It's not Burmese. What are they?
Yeah.
It is Burmese?
Yeah. I haven't picked up enough to have a conversation.
Yeah.
I've picked up enough to, like, you know, say phrases and answer basic questions.
Yeah. But there was a fair amount of English being spoken around you then, or
I mean,
some?
There were 2 people in my area, and 0 guards.
Well, that's pretty isolating.
Yeah, anytime I had to communicate with them, or anytime they had to communicate the rules to me so that I would stop doing something I wasn't supposed to do, like turn the light off at night, we had to we had to get people in there to sort of explain, translate. Yeah.
Were you mistreated, did you feel like at any time? Hit? Pushed around?
No. Not by the prison guards. I mean, by the system and by the military and by the decision to keep me there. But no, I wasn't hitting, I wasn't beaten, I wasn't starved.
Yeah. It's an amazing story, man. I hope you've committed it all to notes, because it's going to be is going to be quite a remembrance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What was the best book you read while you were in prison?
There's a lot of contenders. The one that was the most intense read that sticks in my mind, probably because it was the longest. There's a book, Infinite Jest, that I've tried to read a bunch of times and I've never gotten.
I've not gotten through it.
Yeah. I went all the way through it in about 10 or 11 days, which that by itself, reading it every day for a confined period makes every. That's the thing about reading is like, I would read. I'm trying to think what the longest one. I think like maybe East of Eden or something. A pretty thick book in a period of 2 or 3 days. It's a completely different reading experience. You really live in the world of that book.
Yeah, pretty intense.
Yeah.
That's great.